Mic check 1 2 1 2. It's the Y2K Collector, top of the morning, and welcome to a new week, as well as welcome to the end of September and the end of the third quarter of 2024. And one of the biggest questions that's running through my mind right now is what is actually happening with the prices of retro video games? It's kind of hard to tell. As many of you know, I spent the entire weekend doing some sorting of retro games, just picking out the games that I definitely want to keep in the collection. And then obviously I've just been kind of categorizing them by value, to be honest with you. I've been kind of just, lining them up based on some of the more expensive games, like the ones you will see here in this stack. And then, of course, some of the more mid-tier games. And then I've got some of the lesser expensive games in the corner. But for about 2 to 3 years at the start of 2020, we saw a massive spike in retro game prices. I would say that, man, across the board, maybe a 30 to 35% spike. You guys let me know down in the comments how much you think game prices spiked between the start of 2020 and I'd say the end of 2022. Because I think that 2-year run was probably the highest and largest 2-year run of retro game prices. And I know that in some cases you had games that were pretty much worthless that overnight became $100 games. And then you had other games that maybe went up 10, 15, 20%. And we saw this huge jump in the price of retro games and even some modern games. There were some Switch games that we also saw spike something crazy in price between 2020 and 2022. And so I think where a lot of people were at, like a lot of people who either left the hobby or paused in collecting, a lot of people, I think, said, I'm just going to wait until prices drop back down to re-engage with this hobby because the prices are becoming absurd. And I think in large part, what we've seen, I would say across the board, like if I had to estimate, I would say between 30 to 35% across the board is what we saw in terms of price increases. And someone can run the math. I'm sure we can go on price charting and look that up and gather that information. There's a dude that I used to watch. He doesn't post as much anymore. I think his name is Super Nintendo. And he would do this, he had this like Retronomics series where he did these really in-depth breakdowns of price increases across different systems. And he would take a sample size of games for the console and kind of, I guess, extrapolate his numbers from, the sample size. And I thought that was pretty cool. But here we are now, we're to 2024, we're getting into 2025 now. We're a few years removed, and the big question is what's happening with retro game prices today and where do we think things will go moving forward? So as someone who has had to look up a lot of prices, because every time I add a game to my collection, I always check the price. And then if I'm getting ready to sell a game, I'm also checking the price history as well. And from what I'm seeing, when it comes to retro game prices, in my opinion, there has not been a huge drop off in prices. I would say that there are certain games that have dropped back down, but across the board, we might have seen maybe a 10% drop from the 2020 highs, maybe 10 to 15%. I don't know if this is the floor when it comes to average pricing for some of these games, but I do know that a lot of these games are holding their value. And I think the next big jump that we're going to see in terms of pricing for a lot of this physical media, this playable physical media, I think the next big jump is going to come when the transition to digital only has been solidified. I talked about this over the weekend about there being a solid 40 to 45 year window of physical video games being made available that people actually care about, right? I'm talking about like consoles that people care about. There's about a 40 to 45 year window of worth of games for, collectors to absorb into their collections. And I think 10 to 15 years from now, when all of this stuff becomes digital only, I think that's when we're going to start to see another big jump in prices overall for retro games. Now what I think is going to determine the individual prices is going to be their online accessibility. That to me will be the biggest thing. Now, I don't think that companies like Xbox, Nintendo, Sony, I don't think they're just going to keep servers alive or continue to um occupy data and storage space with games that people don't care about. I think if they do keep some retro games alive, I think that they're only really going to keep the ones alive that a lot of people really care about. Games that a lot of people want to play and have like a cult huge following. I think when it comes to some of the more niche titles, when it comes to some of those, obscure titles that don't have as big of a fan base, I don't know if server space is going to be occupied with those games. And so I think as they start to shut down servers and a lot of those things are no longer maintained at a commercial corporate level, that's when you're going to see the individual prices for certain games drop or spike. And then obviously you also have the influence of like pop culture, what's happening in television, what's happening in movies, what's happening in media. All those things are going to impact the price of games as well. And then hype, right? Hype, general fanfare is also going to, play a huge role in the prices of some of those games. But we've seen, and then obviously, nostalgia, right? Because we've seen massive fluctuations in prices for certain games. Over the summer, you had games like Velvet Assassin that was like a $13 game jump up to $45. You had games like Deadpool. It was a $20 game, jumped to $70, and now it's dropped back down to $40 or $35. You've had other games like Champions Return to Arms and Champions of Norath. These were $40 to $45 games during the height of 2020, but now these are somewhere between $35 and $40 games. So they've taken somewhat of a drop. And then you go across the board. There are games that have just been perpetually cheap. Ninja Gaiden's always been a cheap game. I think it's going to stay cheap. Same thing like with Dark Kingdom. These will always be $5-6 games. The Transformers games, these games spiked a little bit in price. These shot up a little bit, and now I think they're leveling off, right? So, I think it just ranges. It ranges and it changes based on, people's interest and people discovering. Some folks don't even know about some of these games, or they assume, they have assumptions about some games. When you look at like the DS, obviously there are some really expensive titles on the DS, but once everyone gets over Pokemon and they realize that there are other games on the DS outside of Pokemon, they'll discover games like Episode 3 and Thor, which they might think are just bad ports of a 3D game, not realizing that these are actually two very amazing 2D sprite-based games that look amazing on the DS and play like awesome beat 'em up slash hack and slash games. So, there's just games that a lot of people haven't had the ability to discover yet because they're really just kind of stuck on, things that they're seeing on YouTube or games that they're watching other people play, and they haven't really taken the chance to step out of their comfort zone and look for other games. I think though, when it comes to like your more expensive games, I think these will always be expensive. I don't know if there's ever going to be a port of Def Jam Fight for New York to any system. Between the music that's on this game, the likeness, the characters on this game, and the likeness of those characters, when you think about all the rappers that are on this game, the music that's on this game, it'll be a licensing nightmare to try and port this game to a modern console or remake this game or remaster this game. Games like Def Jam Fight for New York just might be locked on the PlayStation 2. Now, I know a lot of people said that about Marvel vs. Capcom 2. A lot of people said, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is going to live and die on the Dreamcast, PS2, and Xbox. But here we are in 2024, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is now available on your Switch and your PS4 and whatever else. However, we know licenses like these won't last forever. So even with this game making its way to the Switch and to the PS4, Odds are it won't stay on those consoles for long. They'll probably be delisted, they'll lose the rights, and the only people who will have access to the game on the PS4 and Switch will be people who had the physical copy. So that's the other part to this physical media stuff, is like the licensing, the properties. These things don't last forever, but the plastic will. The information that's been written on the plastic will, and as long as you have the plastic, that's what I think matters to those who want to engage in the media. It's like a CD, it's like a cassette tape, it's like anything else. And you know, it's funny, you look at someone like Aaliyah, the singer. For those of you who don't know, Aaliyah is a very famous R&B singer. I grew up on Aaliyah. I had a lot of family members who grew up on Aaliyah, but a lot of Aaliyah's catalog and music wasn't available on any of the streaming platforms. And I don't know if it's even available now. And unless you actually had Aaliyah CDs or Aaliyah cassette tapes, you really weren't able to download and listen to Aaliyah's music. Or let me do one that's a little bit more popular. Dr. Dre. I think everybody knows who Dr. Dre is. Dr. Dre, The Chronic, you couldn't download The Chronic for a really long time. It wasn't until like a few years ago that you could finally download The Chronic and listen to The Chronic. And if you don't know what The Chronic is, then you're really young, and you're making me feel old. But for those of you who know about The Chronic is Dr. Dre's most iconic album. Came out in the 90s, early 90s. And if you haven't heard of it, go download it and listen to it, and then come back and comment on the channel if you've never heard of The Chronic. But my point is that The Chronic wasn't available either, due to licensing issues. And it wasn't until a few years ago that you could actually download it. So I think those factors are what make the physical media so much more valuable when you think about it. So in a nutshell, what do I think? I think video game prices are stagnant. I think there's a little bit of stagnancy in the prices of retro games. I do think that the price for some games are going down, and the prices for a lot of games are actually still going up. I think it just depends on which console you're talking about, and which genre you're talking about. I think certain RPGs and certain shoot 'em ups will always be expensive. Certain beat 'em ups will always be expensive. Certain action games will always be expensive. But then you'll just have those AAA titles. I think AAA titles are the ones that probably will dip the most. Very common AAA big box titles, because those are the ones that are going to probably have the longest lifespan on a digital platform, because they've got a lot of money and big studios behind them. But I could be dead wrong. You guys let me know. It's Monday. I'm just having conversation here, just talking about where we're at with retro game prices. Let me know what you think. If you've been in the market picking up games or selling games, let me know what you've seen with the price of retro games, and I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.